Learn English through story. The Lover's Secret. Nina Lawson had always believed in love. She was the kind of person who lived for passion, for that deep connection that transcended time and space, the kind that poets wrote about. She had married David, her college sweetheart, with the dream that they would grow old together, their love only growing deeper with the years. But as time passed, Nina began to feel a quiet unease growing in her marriage. David, a successful lawyer, was often absent, caught up in his career, constantly working late or on business trips. Their once vibrant relationship had settled into a monotonous routine, and with it, Nina's heart began to ache in ways she couldn't explain. She loved David, but she was no longer sure she felt the same passion she once had for him. She missed the excitement, the energy that used to flow so freely between them. It was in the midst of this emotional void that she met Theo. Theo Parker was everything David was not: spontaneous, free-spirited, a man who exuded charm and confidence without effort. He was an artist, a photographer, and his work took him to various parts of the world, capturing the raw beauty of people, places, and emotions. Theo was a breath of fresh air in Nina's life, offering her a new perspective on the world she had grown accustomed to. Their first meeting was accidental, a chance encounter at an art gallery where Nina had gone alone to escape the silence of her home. Theo was standing near one of his own photographs, studying the light and shadows of the image, when Nina walked in. Their eyes met across the room, and something shifted. It was a quiet moment, nothing overtly dramatic, but in that instant, Nina felt a spark of feeling she hadn't experienced in years. As the weeks went by, Nina found herself drawn to Theo more and more. They began meeting for coffee, for walks in the park, for long conversations about art, life, and the complexities of human relationships. With Theo, Nina felt alive again, as though the passion she had lost had been reignited in the simplest of moments. He made her laugh, he made her feel seen, and most importantly, he made her feel desired. It didn't take long before their connection deepened, transforming from friendship into something much more dangerous, something forbidden. Theo was everything Nina had been missing in her marriage, and despite the guilt that gnawed at her conscience, she couldn't resist the pull. The chemistry between them was undeniable, and they gave into it. But as their affair unfolded, Nina couldn't shake the sense that what she was doing was wrong. She had never imagined herself as someone who would betray the person she loved. Yet, with Theo, everything felt so right, so effortless. She convinced herself that it was just a brief escape from the suffocating reality of her marriage. It would pass, but deep down, Nina knew that what they had was more than a mere escape. It was something real. Theo, for all his charm and warmth, was not entirely the person Nina had come to believe he was. Like Nina, Theo was trapped in his own cage of secrets. He had a past that he carefully guarded, one that he never spoke of to Nina. But their affair, with all its passion and intensity, began to unearth things within him that he had kept buried for years. Theo had grown up in a family where emotional intimacy was a foreign concept. His parents, wealthy and distant, had never given him the love or affection he had craved. As a result, he had become a man who avoided deep connections, preferring fleeting encounters and shallow relationships. But Nina was different. She was more than just another passing lover. He saw in her not just a woman he could be with, but someone he could truly be himself with. Someone who saw him for who he truly was, without judgment. Still, he couldn't fully let go of his past. There was a part of him that was always keeping his distance, a part of him that couldn't bring himself to trust. He had his own demons, old wounds that he couldn't quite heal. His commitment to Nina, despite his growing feelings for her, was shadowed by his need to keep certain things hidden, including the painful truth of why he could never fully commit to her. The affair continued, with moments of passion and tenderness, but also with moments of tension and confusion. Nina found herself standing on the edge, torn between the life she had built with David and the whirlwind of emotion she had with Theo. And just as she thought she had begun To understand the depth of her feelings for Theo, the unspoken truths between them began to surface, threatening to tear them apart. One evening, after a particularly intense and emotional encounter, Nina asked Theo a question that had been weighing on her mind for weeks. She had never asked about his past, never pressed him for details about his life before her. But that night, as they lay together, she couldn't hold it back any longer. "Why don't you ever talk about your past, Theo? Your family, your childhood, your life before me?" she asked, her voice soft, yet laced with curiosity. Theo's eyes went dark, and he pulled away from her. The tension in the room thickened as he remained silent. Nina could feel the walls go up, the distance between them growing with each passing second. She regretted asking, but at the same time, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that there was more to Theo than he was willing to share. "I don't talk about my past because it doesn't matter," Theo replied finally, his voice tight. "What matters is the here and now, with you." Nina knew there was more to it than that. There was always more to Theo, and that was when she realized that the affair she had with him was not just a reflection of the emptiness in her marriage, but also a way for both of them to avoid confronting the deeper issues in their lives. Nina's heart ached as she realized the extent of the secrets they were both keeping. She couldn't fully embrace the future she envisioned with Theo until he could face his past, until he could stop running from the truths that haunted him. Weeks later, Nina was forced to make a decision. David, who had been distant for months, had finally come to her, desperate to understand what had happened to their marriage. He knew something was wrong, knew that their relationship was hanging by a thread. David was unaware of the affair, but he had felt the growing distance between them. He was willing to work on their marriage, to try and fix what had gone wrong. But Nina was no longer sure that she could. Her love for David had always been steady, dependable. But with Theo, she had found a fire she had never known before. The question that haunted her was whether that fire could sustain her in the long run, or if it was simply an illusion of passion, a fleeting moment in a life she had already built with David. Nina found herself at a crossroads. She had spent so many years waiting for a love that would ignite her soul, and now that it was here, she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to face the consequences of her actions. The guilt of betraying David weighed heavily on her. She knew she needed to make a choice, but the thought of losing either man left her torn apart. As Nina wrestled with her emotions, Theo made a decision of his own. One evening, after a particularly quiet dinner together, he told Nina something that changed everything. "I can't do this anymore, Nina," he said, his voice heavy with finality. "I love you, but I can't keep running from my past. And I can't keep holding you back from the life you deserve." Nina looked at him, confused. "What do you mean? What are you saying, Theo?" "I'm saying that I've realized something important," Theo continued, his gaze unwavering. "This affair, as much as I've wanted you, is just another way of avoiding the real issues in my life. I'm not ready for what you need. I can't be the man you want me to be. You deserve someone who can give you everything, someone who can offer you stability, honesty, and the kind of love that doesn't come with secrets." Theo's words struck Nina like a blow to the chest. She had never expected him to end things, but in the end, it was his inability to confront his own demons that led to the end of their affair. And though it hurt, she knew he was right. Their love had been intense, but it had also been built on unspoken truths and unacknowledged fears. After the affair ended, Nina was left to pick up the pieces of her life. She returned to David, but things were never the same. The love they shared had changed, irrevocably altered by the affair. But as time passed, Nina realized something important. The affair had taught her something about herself. It had shown her that love was not just about passion, it was about vulnerability, honesty, and the willingness to face one's own truths. She didn't know what the future held, but Nina knew one thing. She was no longer afraid of the truth. Whether she stayed with David or chose to go her own way, she knew that she had to live a life built on honesty, both with herself and with others. Nina Lawson sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window at the city skyline. It had been a year since she had met Theo Parker, a year that had changed the trajectory of her life in ways she could never have anticipated. She had always believed in the sanctity of love, the kind of love that was enduring, the kind that weathered the tests of time. But as she looked back at the last 12 months, she couldn't help but question everything she thought she knew about relationships, fidelity, and the true meaning of happiness. Her marriage to David, once filled with excitement and youthful passion, had become an exercise in routine. The late-night dinners, the long hours at the office, and the endless meetings had taken their toll on their relationship. David had become a stranger to her, someone she no longer recognized, and the emotional intimacy they once shared had faded into the background of their busy lives. But it wasn't just the distance that troubled Nina, it was the growing sense of dissatisfaction that had lodged itself deep in her heart. David was a good man. He provided for her, supported her ambitions, and was dependable in every sense of the word. But as time wore on, she found herself craving something more, something deeper. And that's when she met Theo. Theo Parker was unlike anyone Nina had ever known. He was spontaneous, unpredictable, and full of life. He saw the world differently through the lens of an artist, and his passion for everything he did was contagious. When they met, Nina was immediately captivated by his energy. He spoke with an intensity that both intrigued and intimidated her. He had a way of making the world seem more vibrant, more alive, and for the first time in years, Nina felt a spark of something she had long forgotten: desire. Their conversations flowed effortlessly, as if they had known each other for years. They talked about art, about life, about the things that truly mattered. Theo made her feel seen in a way David no longer did. He listened without judgment, never trying to fix her or tell her what she needed to do. He allowed her to simply be. Nina didn't set out to have an affair. It wasn't something she had planned or even wanted. But the connection between her and Theo grew undeniably powerful. What began as innocent meetings in coffee shops and casual walks through the city soon escalated into something more intense, more passionate. The guilt that weighed heavily on Nina's shoulders was quickly overshadowed by the desire that consumed her every thought. Her affair with Theo was everything. Her marriage with David wasn't. Exciting, liberating, and full of raw, unfiltered emotion. She could no longer deny that she had fallen deeply in love with him. But as she fell deeper into the web of their secret relationship, the guilt grew unbearable. The lies she told to cover her tracks became more elaborate, and the distance between her and David widened. But as Nina's affair with Theo blossomed, she began to realize that not everything was as it seemed. Theo, for all his charm and confidence, was a man with his own hidden scars. Despite the carefree image he projected, there was a darkness in his eyes, a sadness that he rarely spoke of. Nina sensed it, but whenever she asked him about his past, he would deflect, shifting the conversation to something lighter. It wasn't that Theo didn't care for Nina, he did deeply, but his reluctance to open up about his past spoke volumes about his inability to confront his own emotional baggage. He was a man who had learned to bury his emotions, to protect himself from the pain that intimacy brought. The fear of getting too close to anyone had driven him to keep things casual in his relationships, never allowing anyone to truly see the real him. The more Nina pressed, the more Theo pulled away, which only deepened the mystery surrounding him. He never spoke of his family, his childhood, or the relationships he had left behind. It was as though his past was something to be avoided, something too painful to revisit. Nina, too, had her own fears, her own insecurities, but she found herself unable to resist the magnetic pull of Theo's charisma. She was drawn to him in a way she couldn't explain. Still, there was an unsettling feeling that lingered at the back of her mind. She wanted to know more about the man she had given her heart to, but she wasn't sure she would ever get the truth. It became clear that the affair wasn't just a way for Nina to escape her marriage. It was also a way for Theo to avoid facing the truth of his own life. They were both running from something, each seeking solace in the other while avoiding the difficult conversations they both needed to have. Nina's marriage to David continued to deteriorate, even as her relationship with Theo deepened. David, oblivious to his wife's infidelity, was growing more distant. He had always been a workaholic, but his focus on his career had reached new extremes. He spent long hours at the office, often returning home late, exhausted. and emotionally unavailable. Nina had tried to reach out to him, to rekindle the flame that once burned so brightly between them, but he was unreachable. Their connection had weakened to the point of almost non-existence. One evening, after a particularly heated argument with David about his lack of attention to their marriage, Nina found herself seeking comfort in Theo's arms. They met at a small, quiet cafe, and from the moment they locked eyes, all the unresolved tension between them melted away. Their kiss was electric, filled with the passion of both longing and desperation. They retreated to Theo's apartment, and for the first time in weeks, Nina felt as though she could finally breathe. But as she lay next to him that night, her mind started to race. The guilt she had been suppressing bubbled to the surface. How could she betray David, the man she had once promised to love and cherish? How could she reconcile the love she felt for both David and Theo, when the two worlds she had created could never coexist? The following days were filled with emotional turmoil. Nina tried to distance herself from Theo, but every time she saw him, the pull was too strong. She found herself caught in a dangerous cycle every time she tried to step away. She was drawn back in by the intensity of their connection. But as the affair continued, Nina began to realize something important. She was not the only one keeping secrets. Theo's behavior had grown increasingly erratic. He would disappear for days at a time, not answering Nina's calls or texts. When they did speak, his tone was distant, and his words lacked the warmth they once held. It became clear that Theo was hiding something from her, something important. She confronted him about it, but Theo only grew defensive, refusing to open up. For the first time, Nina felt the weight of the lies they had both been living. She had assumed that Theo's secrets were simply a matter of past pain, but now, she realized that the man she had fallen for was just as flawed, just as capable of deception as the man she had been married to for years. The tipping point came one evening when Nina received an unexpected phone call. It was from one of Theo's old friends, a man named Ben, who had known him for years. Ben's voice was urgent, his words sharp with concern. "Nina, you need to know something," Ben said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Theo is not who you think he is. He's been lying to you." Nina's heart pounded in her chest as she listened to Ben's revelations. It turned out that Theo's past was far darker than she had ever imagined. He had a history of broken relationships, betrayals, and emotional manipulation. Theo had never been able to commit to anyone, and he had used Nina as a temporary distraction from the painful reality of his own unresolved issues. His charm and passion were just a mask, a way to hide the deep fear he had of being truly loved and accepted. The truth hit Nina like a tidal wave. She had fallen for a man who had been running from his own demons, just as she had been running from her marriage. The affair was no longer just an escape. It was a reflection of the pain and confusion they both carried within themselves. But the more she learned about Theo, the more she realized that their love was built on shaky ground. There was no future for them, not in the way she had hoped. The revelation about Theo's past left Nina shattered, but it also gave her the clarity she needed to make a decision. She could no longer continue living in the shadows of lies and secrets. She had to face the truth, not only about Theo, but about herself and the life she had built with David. She knew what she had to do. Nina ended things with Theo that same night. She told him the truth, that their love had been a fleeting illusion, a dangerous escape from the real work of healing and growth. Theo, for the first time, seemed genuinely vulnerable. He admitted that he had always feared true intimacy and had sabotaged every meaningful connection in his life. He wasn't ready for the kind of love Nina needed, and so, their affair ended. Nina returned to David, but things were not easy. The damage caused by her betrayal could not be undone overnight. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Nina began to rebuild her life. She and David sought therapy, addressing the issues that had caused the cracks in their relationship. Though it was difficult, they slowly began to reconnect, this time with honesty, vulnerability, and a shared commitment to understanding one another. The Lover's Secret is a story about the consequences of living in secrecy, of running away from the painful truths that we refuse to confront. It shows that while love can be beautiful and passionate, it must be rooted in honesty, vulnerability, and the willingness to face the truths of who we are. The story ultimately teaches us that we cannot find true love by avoiding the difficult parts of ourselves and our relationships. True love requires the courage to confront the secrets we keep and the strength to face our deepest fears. Only when Nina embraced the truth of her actions and the reality of her marriage could she begin to heal. And only then could she truly understand that love, in its purest form, is not about passion alone but about honesty, trust, and the willingness to be vulnerable with those we hold closest to our hearts. After that night with Ben's phone call, Nina felt a deep pit in her stomach. The truth she had been avoiding for months suddenly became impossible to ignore. The affair had started as an escape, a distraction from the pain of a slowly dying marriage, but it had evolved into something far more complicated. The fantasy of being with Theo, of feeling desired and truly seen, had blurred her judgment, but now, the reality of who Theo was and what she had allowed herself to become was painfully clear. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence of the night enveloped her. She felt isolated, trapped in her own choices. She had chosen Theo over her marriage, over the life she had once loved. The secret affair had given her fleeting moments of happiness, but now it only left her with a deep, aching emptiness. She had been living in a fantasy world, and the harsh reality was now crashing down on her. Nina had always considered herself a woman of integrity. She had prided herself on being honest, caring, and thoughtful. But her affair with Theo had shattered that image of herself. She had become someone she barely recognized, a woman who could lie to her husband, deceive the person she loved the most, and justify it all for a few stolen moments of excitement. The shame that followed was suffocating. She had betrayed David, and in doing so, she had betrayed herself. The guilt gnawed at her every waking moment, making it impossible to focus on anything else. It was like a heavy weight around her neck, a constant reminder of the woman she had become. Her phone buzzed with a message from Theo, another late-night text that simply read, "I miss you." The familiar warmth of his words sent a jolt through her, but it was no longer the same. The feelings that had once surged to life whenever she saw his name on her screen now felt hollow. She could no longer ignore the truth. She had been using Theo as an emotional crutch, just as he had been using her. Nina didn't reply to the message. Instead, she sat quietly, staring at the phone in her hand, feeling a strange sense of relief. Her heart felt lighter, but it also felt broken. She knew what she had to do. She needed to sever ties with Theo completely. She needed to face her fears, her mistakes, and find a way to heal herself before she could even begin to think about healing her marriage. Ending things with Theo was not an easy decision. He had become an integral part of her life, someone who made her feel alive, passionate, and important. But deep down, she knew that their relationship was built on a fragile foundation of lies and half-truths. If they had any chance at survival, they would need to be fully open with each other about their pasts, their fears, and the painful truths they had been avoiding. She had already seen the cracks in Theo's facade, and now she had to face the cracks in herself. The conversation was brief but emotional. Theo didn't fight her decision. He knew, just as she did, that their affair had reached its natural conclusion. There was no future for them, at least, not in the way Nina had once imagined. The passion they shared had been intoxicating, but it was not sustainable. Both of them had used it to distract from the parts of themselves that needed healing. As Nina ended their relationship, there was no dramatic confrontation, no angry words exchanged. There was only a quiet acknowledgement that they were both lost in their own ways. Afterward, Nina felt a strange sense of numbness. She wasn't sure if it was relief or sorrow, but she knew she had made the right choice. In the silence that followed the end of her affair, she could hear her own voice again, the one she had almost forgotten. Amidst the chaos of lies and deception, the real challenge now was facing David, the man who had once been the love of her life, the person she had vowed to spend forever with. She knew she had broken him, just as she had broken herself. How could she explain her betrayal? How could she tell him that? For the past year, she had been emotionally and physically unfaithful to him. Nina's heart raced as she stood in the doorway of their home. David was sitting in the living room, his back turned to her as he fiddled with his phone. He looked tired, exhausted even. The signs of their strained relationship were obvious in his posture, his weary expression, and the deep bags under his eyes. Their marriage had been on life support for so long. It was hard to remember the days when they were happy. But even with all the pain between them, Nina still loved him. She still cared for him deeply. "David," she said softly, her voice trembling. He turned around slowly, as though surprised to hear her speak at all. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence between them was thick, suffocating, filled with everything that had gone unspoken for far too long. David finally sighed, his gaze dropping to the floor. "What is it, Nina?" Her throat tightened as she fought to hold back the tears. "I've done something terrible," she whispered. "Something unforgivable." David looked up at her, confusion and a faint hint of fear in his eyes. "What do you mean?" I've been unfaithful to you," Nina said, the words hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. She could barely hear her own voice, as if it came from a distant place. She had never imagined she would be the one to betray him, but here she was, confessing to the one person she had sworn to love and honor. David's face went pale, his lips parted, but no words came out. He just stared at her, as though waiting for the truth to sink in, to make sense of the situation. "I met someone else," Nina continued, her voice breaking. "It started innocently, but it became something more, something I couldn't control. I love him, David. I don't know how it happened, but I do." David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He turned away from her, pacing the room in stunned silence. Nina's heart shattered with every step he took away from her. "I don't know what to say," David said finally, his voice low and thick with emotion. "How long?" "Almost a year," Nina whispered, her words barely audible. She felt a deep sense of shame, as though she were confessing to a crime she had no excuse for. David's expression shifted, a mixture of hurt, disbelief, and rage crossing his face. "A year?" His voice rose, cracking with emotion. "You've been lying to me for a year?" "I'm so sorry, David," Nina choked out, tears streaming down her face. "I never meant for it to happen. He cut her off, his voice cold. Don't." Nina fell silent, watching as David walked out of the room, unable to hold back the tears. The pain in his eyes, the look of betrayal and confusion, was too much for her to bear, but she couldn't stop now. She had to face the consequences of her actions. The days that followed were some of the hardest Nina had ever experienced. David withdrew further into himself, refusing to speak to her for days on end. They barely communicated, except for the occasional exchange of words that felt more like accusations than conversation. Nina stayed in the house, unsure of where else to go, and she spent hours thinking about her choices, about how to fix the damage she had done. In the weeks that followed, they began therapy. The counselor helped them navigate the painful process of rebuilding trust, something that seemed impossible at first. David struggled to understand how Nina could have betrayed him, while Nina grappled with the guilt of her actions. But through the slow and painful process of therapy, they began to rebuild brick by brick. David didn't forgive her overnight, nor did Nina expect him to. There were moments of anger, tears, and deep hurt, but gradually, they learned to talk to each other again, to understand each other's pain, and to explore the deep-rooted issues in their marriage that had led to the affair in the first place. They worked through the bitterness, the resentment, and the fear, and slowly, Nina began to understand that love wasn't just about passion, it was about trust, vulnerability, and the willingness to face the difficult truths that lay between two people. The Lover's Secret explores the consequences of living in secrecy and the destructive power of betrayal. It teaches that love, while a source of joy and fulfillment, requires honesty, transparency, and self-awareness. We cannot find true happiness or lasting love by running from our problems or hiding behind masks of perfection. The truth, however painful, is the only path to healing and growth. Only when Nina confronted the secrets she had been keeping and began to face the reality of her own mistakes could she truly begin the difficult journey of self-forgiveness and, perhaps, the possibility of healing her marriage. True love is not just about passion or infatuation, but about being real with each other and facing the hard truths together. The weight of Nina's confession to David hung in the air like a suffocating cloud. Her heart raced, her palms sweat, and yet there was a strange sense of relief. She had finally said it out loud. Her secret was no longer a silent burden she had to carry alone. But as soon as the words left her mouth, the enormity of what she had done hit her full force. She had betrayed her best friend, her partner, her husband. The guilt tore through her like a wildfire, scalding every part of her that she had once thought was intact. But there was something else too, a deep, unsettling void. It was as though, in betraying David, Nina had also betrayed the very woman she once thought she was. Who had she become? A liar? A cheater? A woman who had looked for validation in the arms of someone else, rather than confronting her own pain? This realization shook her to the core. She had used Theo to escape, to fill the emotional emptiness that had been festering for so long. But in doing so, she had lost a part of herself she wasn't sure she could ever get back. David's reaction was everything Nina had feared. He didn't scream. He didn't lash out in fury. But there was a coldness in his eyes that was far more terrifying than any anger could have been. He simply stared at her, as though he were processing the magnitude of what she had confessed. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. "Why, Nina?" he asked, his voice shaking with a quiet intensity. "Why did you do this to me? To us?" Nina felt herself falter under the intensity of his gaze. She wanted to explain herself, to somehow make him understand that she hadn't meant for any of this to happen. But there were no words that could ever make her actions justifiable. There was no way to undo the hurt she had caused. "I don't know," she whispered. "I got lost. I couldn't find a way out of my own head. I was hurting David, and I thought this would fix it. But it didn't. I just made everything worse." David's face hardened. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't know that you've been unhappy? But that's what we do in a marriage, Nina. We talk about it. We work through it. We don't lie. We don't betray each other." "I know," Nina choked out, feeling the shame crash down on her like an overwhelming wave. "I was weak. I was selfish." David shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. "Selfish? You weren't just selfish. You were cruel. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed yourself too." Nina felt like she was drowning. She wanted to reach out to him, to touch him, to do anything to erase the pain she had caused. But she knew it was too late for that now. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The trust between them had been shattered beyond repair. For the first time in years, Nina felt completely alone. The man she had once shared everything with, the man who had been her partner, her best friend, now seemed like a stranger. The space between them grew wider with every passing second, and Nina feared that they would never bridge the gap. The days following her confession were filled with an oppressive silence. David became withdrawn, retreating into himself more and more. He no longer looked at her the way he once did, with the adoration that had once been so evident in his eyes. Now, his gaze was cold, distant, as if she were a ghost, someone he no longer recognized. Nina tried to reach out to him, to apologize, to do anything that might bring them back to the place they had once shared. But every time she did, David would retreat further. His responses clipped, his emotions guarded. She was devastated. She had expected anger, maybe even rage. But what she didn't anticipate was the quiet sorrow that seemed to permeate every conversation. His hurt was palpable, and it dug deep into Nina's soul. She had destroyed the very thing that had been her anchor in life, her marriage. And now, she wasn't sure if it could ever be repaired. It was during one of their therapy sessions, weeks after the initial blow-up, that Nina realized how deeply the affair had wounded David. the therapist guided them through the process of unpacking the hurt. But it was clear that David was struggling to even begin. He wasn't ready to forgive, and Nina didn't know how to ask for forgiveness when she hadn't yet forgiven herself. David, the therapist said gently, the road to healing isn't a straight line. It's not about forgetting or pretending it didn't happen. It's about facing the pain, understanding why it happened, and deciding if you're willing to move forward from it. Nina's heart clenched. She had never stopped loving David, but she now realized just how much damage she had caused. The truth was, she hadn't just hurt him with the affair. She had taken something precious from him, his trust, his faith in her, and rebuilding that would require far more than just words of apology. Do you still love me? David asked, his voice a whisper. Nina froze. That simple question cut through her like a knife. She wanted to say yes, but the truth was far more complicated. She loved him, yes, but she also loved the idea of redemption. She wanted to fix everything, to turn back time. But love, she now realized, wasn't something that could be fixed with simple gestures. It wasn't a puzzle you could piece back together with enough effort. It was fragile, vulnerable, and it demanded both trust and transparency. I love you, Nina said, her voice thick with emotion. But I know that love isn't enough. I've hurt you in a way that I can't undo. I don't expect things to go back to how they were. But I'm willing to do the work, David, if you'll let me. I want to rebuild both myself and us. David's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't speak. He just looked at her, his face a mixture of pain and something else, something that Nina couldn't quite name. The process of rebuilding trust was painstaking. They both knew it would take time, maybe years, for David to fully trust her again. But Nina was committed. She was committed to healing herself, to understanding why she had made such destructive choices, and to doing the work necessary to earn David's trust back. They continued with therapy, both individually and together. Nina began to examine the roots of her own emotional pain, the deep-seated fear of abandonment, the insecurities that had driven her to seek validation from someone other than her husband. She explored the ways in which she had neglected her own emotional needs and allowed her marriage to fall into a rut, believing that love alone could sustain them without effort. But through the therapy, she began to understand that true love wasn't just about romantic gestures or physical intimacy. It was about vulnerability, about sharing the messy parts of yourself, and about supporting each other through the highs and lows of life. As the months passed, there were moments of progress and moments of regression. Sometimes, Nina would catch a glimpse of the man she had married, the man who had once held her hand and made her laugh. But other times, there was a cold distance between them, a reminder of the breach that still existed. The healing process was not linear, and there were days when it felt as though they would never get back to the place they once were. Still, Nina persisted. She took full responsibility for her actions, and she stopped hiding from her own mistakes. Slowly, David began to soften. There were still moments when the anger and hurt resurfaced, but there was also the flicker of something else. Hope. Hope that, with time, they could rebuild their connection. Hope that love, in its truest form, was not about perfection, but about forgiveness and understanding. One quiet evening, months after the affair had ended and the therapy sessions had become less frequent, Nina sat with David on the couch. They were no longer the same people they had been before, but in that moment, they felt like they were beginning again, together. David reached for her hand, his grip gentle but firm. His touch no longer felt like a cold reminder of betrayal. It felt warm, like the beginning of something new. I don't know if I'll ever completely trust you again, Nina, he said softly, but I'm willing to try. For us, for what we had. Nina nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but she also knew that, for the first time in a long while, they were walking it together. The lover's secret teaches us that love is not about perfection, but about honesty, vulnerability, and growth. It is not enough to simply feel passion. True love requires us to face our darkest fears, confront the mistakes we make, and be willing to rebuild from the ground up. Trust, once broken, takes time to heal, but with patience, effort, and an unwavering commitment to self-improvement, even the most broken relationships can find a path toward healing. It is only through this process of self-awareness, regret, and forgiveness that we can hope to move forward in love. The days that followed Nina's confession to David were a blur. She had never felt so isolated, and each moment spent in the same house as David was another reminder of the chasm that now existed between them. The emptiness she felt wasn't just the result of losing Theo, it was the loss of herself. She was a woman who had once known her own identity, her own needs, her own desires. But now, as she sat in their shared home, it was as if she was looking at a stranger's life, wondering how everything had gone so terribly wrong. Nina tried to distract herself from the gnawing emptiness by throwing herself into daily tasks. She cleaned, cooked, and organized as if the mundanity of it all could somehow fill the void left by the affair. But it didn't. It was as though every action she took was a reminder of her betrayal. Every dishwash felt like one more act of penance for the sin she had committed. And yet, nothing she did seemed to ease the ache in her chest. In her quiet moments when she allowed herself to reflect, Nina knew that the affair had been an escape. For years, her marriage had been strained. She and David had become roommates, coexisting rather than truly living together. But rather than confronting these issues, Nina had chosen to numb herself with Theo, to immerse herself in a relationship that was full of passion, but devoid of any real depth. But now, with the dust settled and the secrets exposed, Nina was left with the painful truth. She had neglected her own marriage, and in doing so, she had neglected herself. The affair had become her way of avoiding the hard questions. Why was she unhappy? Why hadn't she spoken to David about how she felt? Why hadn't she been brave enough to ask for what she truly needed? The shame that followed her everywhere was overwhelming. She had betrayed her vows, not just to David, but to herself. In seeking outside validation, Nina had lost sight of the woman she used to be, the woman who had been strong, independent, and whole. Now, she was a shadow of that person, unsure of how to begin the long process of healing. It was clear that simply apologizing and hoping things would improve wasn't enough. Nina knew that their marriage would require more than just time to heal. It needed real effort. For that, they began therapy. At first, Nina was skeptical. Could a stranger truly help them heal the wounds that ran so deep? Could words really make a difference in the wake of such betrayal? But as the weeks passed, she realized that therapy wasn't just about fixing their relationship, it was about fixing herself. With the therapist's guidance, Nina was forced to confront the painful realities of her behavior. She had always prided herself on being the nurturing, selfless partner. But she now saw that she had ignored her own needs for far too long. She had let resentment build up quietly, never addressing her unhappiness. Instead of talking to David about her feelings, she had turned to someone else to fill the void. In therapy, she started learning about her own emotional triggers, why she sought validation outside her marriage, why she had allowed herself to become so disconnected from David, and most painfully, why she had allowed herself to believe the affair was justified. David, too, was forced to reflect on his own role in their deteriorating marriage. He wasn't blameless in their troubles, but the difference was that he had never crossed the line. He had never betrayed Nina's trust, even when their relationship had become distant. But the affair made him realize how much he had emotionally withdrawn from their marriage. He had been consumed by his work, his own struggles, and had neglected Nina's emotional needs. But unlike Nina, he hadn't sought solace outside the marriage. Still, the emotional distance between them had created a space where both of them were suffering in silence. Through therapy, they both began the painful but necessary process of unpacking their issues. Their sessions were often tense, filled with tears and difficult conversations. But in the safe space of the therapist's office, they began to break down the walls that had kept them apart for so long. It was not a quick fix. Each session revealed more painful truths, more wounds that needed tending. But they had both committed to the process, however long it took. The hardest part of Nina's journey was rebuilding the trust she had shattered. She had broken David's heart, and the emotional damage was not something that could be easily fixed. There were no grand gestures that could erase what had happened. Instead, Nina focused on small, daily actions that reflected her commitment to change. She began by being fully transparent. She no longer hid her feelings, no matter how uncomfortable or painful they might be. She spoke openly about her insecurities, her fears, and her desires, and slowly, David began to see the effort she was putting in. He began to see that she wasn't just apologizing for the sake of making things right. She was changing. She was confronting her own demons, not just for their marriage, but for herself. Still, trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. There were days when David would pull away, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. He had every right to feel that way. And while Nina could sense his reluctance to fully let go of the hurt, she refused to give up. She knew that trust would take time, and she was willing to wait as long as it took. They began to spend more time together, just the two of them. They went for walks, revisited old places they had once enjoyed, and found moments of laughter again, albeit tentative ones. The distance between them had been enormous, but in these small moments, Nina saw flickers of the connection they had once shared, and for the first time in months, she dared to hope that it might be possible to rebuild. Even as they worked on their marriage, there were moments when Nina's temptation to fall back into her old habits resurfaced. She had ended things with Theo, but the emotional pull of the affair still lingered in the back of her mind. There were times when she would wonder what could have been, whether she had made the right choice in leaving him behind. One night, several months after the affair had ended, Nina received a message from Theo. She had told herself she would never speak to him again, but the message, so simple and casual, sent a jolt through her chest. "I'm thinking of you. I hope you're doing well." Her heart raced as she stared at the message. Part of her wanted to respond, to tell him how much she missed him, to pick up where they had left off, but another part of her knew that if she did, she would be undoing all the work she had done to rebuild her life. This wasn't just about David anymore, it was about reclaiming her sense of self, her integrity. She stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Finally, with a deep breath, she deleted the message without responding. It was one of the hardest things she had done in her life, but it was also a moment of strength. She realized then that true healing wasn't about just letting go of the affair, it was about reclaiming her own sense of worth without relying on others to define it. The turning point came one evening when Nina and David sat down for dinner after a particularly emotional therapy session. There was no dramatic confrontation, no grand epiphany, but there was a subtle shift in their dynamic. It was as though they had both reached a point where they could breathe a little easier, where the constant tension had finally begun to ease. David reached for her hand across the table, his touch soft but steady. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to completely trust you the way I did before," he said quietly, "but I know that we've come a long way, and I'm willing to keep going if you are." Nina's heart swelled with emotion. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when she could finally see a future with David again, no longer defined by betrayal, but by resilience and a shared commitment to rebuild. "I'm willing," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm willing to fight for us." And in that moment, Nina knew that their road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, more difficult conversations, and moments of doubt. But for the first time in a long while, they were both ready to face the challenges together. The Lover's Secret teaches us that the journey toward healing after betrayal is long, difficult, and filled with moments of self-doubt. True love is not defined by passion alone, but by the willingness to face uncomfortable truths, to admit our wrongs, and to commit to change. Trust is fragile, but it can be rebuilt with time, effort, and unwavering commitment. The story reminds us that growth, both individually and as a couple, is a painful yet necessary process. It is through the struggle to overcome our mistakes and face our flaws that we discover the true strength of love and the transformative power of forgiveness. Days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, yet Nina's guilt never waned. It clung to her like a second skin, a constant reminder of the betrayal she had caused. It wasn't just David that she had hurt. It was the woman she once was, the confident, strong woman who had committed to a path of integrity and loyalty. That person seemed so distant, Now, she had abandoned herself in search of validation in another's arms. And now, in the wake of her actions, she was left questioning her very identity. The therapy sessions, though helpful, were often overwhelming. As she opened up more to the therapist, she began to peel back layers of herself that had long been buried under years of emotional neglect. She had never realized how much she had relied on David to be her anchor. But when that anchor faltered, she had floundered, unsure of how to stay afloat. Nina's journey into self-reflection was uncomfortable. She faced the truth about her fears of abandonment, her insecurities about not being enough, and how she had unconsciously allowed her marriage to fall into a predictable rut. But more than anything, she began to realize that her emotional disconnect had preceded the affair. Theo had been an escape, but it had been more about avoiding her own pain than the failure of her marriage. She had felt unheard and seen, and instead of communicating those feelings to David, she had sought solace in someone else's attention. It was in these moments of reflection that Nina realized how much she had let herself go. She had stopped nurturing her own emotional needs, and in turn, she had stopped nurturing the emotional connection with David. For years, they had merely coexisted, moving through life with routine and complacency. The spark that once ignited their passion had dulled, not because of a lack of love, but because they had both stopped trying. Now, as Nina faced these painful truths, she realized that the road to forgiveness, both from David and herself, would require deep, lasting change. It wasn't enough to apologize. It wasn't enough to just say the words. She had to prove, through her actions and consistent effort, that she was committed to being the woman David needed and the woman she needed to be for herself. David's reaction to Nina's confession had been a silent one. His pain was palpable, but it was the silence that had terrified her most. He wasn't shouting, demanding answers, or unleashing his anger. He simply withdrew, his eyes vacant, his voice distant. In many ways, his silence spoke louder than any words he could have uttered. It wasn't that he hadn't felt the pain of betrayal. It was that he couldn't reconcile the image of Nina he had once known with the woman who had confessed to loving another. For weeks, Nina had lived with the sense of living in the shadow of a man who had emotionally retreated. It was as if David were processing his grief on his own terms, and Nina was left to suffer in isolation, waiting for him to come to terms with the damage she had done. She understood that he needed space, but it didn't make the waiting any easier. There were moments when she would try to approach him, gently asking if he wanted to talk, but he would pull away, giving her nothing more than a stiff nod or a few words, before retreating again into silence. David was a man who had always been composed, calm, and logical. Yet now, his once steadfast demeanor was replaced with a deep sadness that haunted his every word and movement. One night, after weeks of this emotional coldness, Nina sat in the living room, her hands trembling as she stared out the window. The house they had once filled with laughter now felt empty. The walls that once held their joy seemed like a silent witness to the quiet destruction of their marriage. She could hear the soft click of the door opening, and she turned to find David standing there, his face tired and strained. There was something different in his eyes, a sadness, yes, but also something else. There was an acceptance, perhaps, or the beginning of a willingness to heal. Without saying anything, he walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached out and took her hand in his, the contact hesitant at first, but still significant. For a long moment, they simply stood there, locked in that silent exchange. Finally, David spoke, his voice rough but steady. "I don't know what to say, Nina. I don't know how to make this okay, but I want to try, for both of us, for the life we built together." Nina felt a surge of emotion rush through her. There were no guarantees, no promises that everything would magically heal. But in that moment, she realized something fundamental. They had both been broken by what had happened, but they were still standing there together, facing the pain rather than running from it. It wasn't an easy acceptance. It wasn't a simple fix, but it was a step forward. "I want to try too," Nina whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to fix this, but I will do whatever it takes. I will never give up on us." David didn't respond with grand declarations of forgiveness or a sweeping gesture of reconciliation. Instead, he simply pulled her into his arms, holding her as if they both needed that moment of human connection more than anything else. The words they couldn't speak were understood in the quiet strength of that embrace. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was a beginning a new chapter in the painful journey of rebuilding their trust. As the weeks turned into months, Nina found herself deeply committed to doing the hard work of change. She took time to invest in her own self-worth, recognizing that she needed to rebuild herself before she could ever expect to fully rebuild her marriage. This wasn't a journey of appeasing David or seeking his forgiveness. It was about finding the woman she had lost along the way. She began to explore new passions, reconnect with old friends, and confront the patterns that had led her to make the choices she did. She learned that healing wasn't just about fixing the relationship with David. It was about healing the relationship with herself first. She went to therapy alone, continuing to explore the root causes of her emotional disconnection and her search for external validation. She realized that she had often relied on others, whether it was David, Theo, or friends, to give her a sense of worth, rather than looking inward and finding that validation in her own identity. This realization was painful, but it was necessary for her to move forward. She wasn't just apologizing to David, she was apologizing to herself for neglecting her own emotional needs. David, too, began to change. Although his pain was still there, he was learning to process it in healthier ways. He stopped retreating into silence and began to open up more, expressing his feelings instead of bottling them up. This was not an easy change for him. It required vulnerability and an admission that he wasn't as invulnerable as he had once believed. The distance between them began to shrink. Though it would never disappear completely, their shared moments, whether it was a quiet evening at home or a long walk in the park, became more meaningful. They didn't try to force their connection back to what it once was, but rather allowed it to evolve into something different. They were no longer the same people they had been before, but that didn't mean they couldn't create something new together. In the months that followed, Nina and David began to find peace in the imperfection of their situation. They no longer sought the perfect resolution, the fairy tale ending. Instead, they learned to appreciate the small moments, the laughter that returned to their conversations, the quiet understanding that now passed between them, the shared glances that no longer carried the weight of betrayal. There was no sudden dramatic shift, no complete restoration of the trust that had been shattered, but in its place, there was something far more valuable, a quiet, steady commitment to try. Nina had learned that true love was not about avoiding mistakes or never feeling the sting of betrayal. It was about confronting those mistakes head on, working through the pain, and choosing to stand by each other, even when it was difficult. It was about rebuilding trust slowly, piece by piece, and accepting that the past would always be a part of them, but it didn't have to define them. The Lover's Secret is a powerful reminder that love is not just about passion or infatuation. It is about understanding, growth, and the willingness to confront difficult truths. Trust, once broken, is not easily restored, but through consistent effort, vulnerability, and patience, it is possible to rebuild. This journey requires introspection and a deep commitment to change, not just for the sake of the relationship, but for oneself. True healing comes when we learn to accept our imperfections, make amends for the harm we have caused, and allow the process of forgiveness to unfold in its own time. Through this, we find the strength to move forward, together or apart, but always wiser, stronger, and more self-aware. As the weeks turned into months, Nina began to feel the full weight of the consequences of her actions. Every time she caught a glimpse of David, a wave of guilt would crash over her. The pain of betrayal was something she could never take back, and the scars on their relationship were not just visible, they were deep, etched into the fabric of their lives. Each small interaction with David, every shared meal, every brief conversation, was a reminder of what had been lost and what still lay ahead. The slow, painful journey of rebuilding a marriage that had been fractured by betrayal. Nina could not avoid the endless self-questioning that plagued her. Why had I made those choices? What was I searching for outside my marriage? The affair with Theo had seemed like an escape, a chance to feel desired, appreciated, and alive in a way that had been missing from her marriage. But now, in the quiet of her own mind, Nina saw just how much of herself she had lost in that pursuit. She had given her heart to someone else, convinced that the fleeting moments of passion were worth more than the love she had built with David. Even though she was starting to understand the reasons behind her behavior, the guilt remained. Every time she saw David's pained expression or heard the hesitation in his voice, she could not escape the realization that she had violated the most sacred trust between them. And while she understood that healing would take time, she wondered whether David would ever truly forgive her or if she could forgive herself. Nina's journey was not just about mending their relationship. It was about facing the darkest parts of herself. She had to confront the fears and insecurities that had driven her to seek comfort in another man's arms. She had to understand the reasons behind her emotional detachment and why she had not been able to communicate with David when things were slipping away. Therapy sessions continued, both individually and together, but each session peeled back layers of shame and regret that had been buried for so long. Rebuilding trust, Nina learned, was the most difficult part of the entire process. Trust was not something that could be demanded or given overnight. It was earned slowly, painstakingly through consistent, meaningful actions. David understandably was hesitant. Though his love for Nina had not disappeared, the wound was deep, and his fear of being hurt again lingered in every interaction. It wasn't enough for Nina to apologize or express her remorse. She had to prove day by day that she was worthy of his trust once more. There were days when David would withdraw emotionally, his distance palpable. These moments were painful for Nina, as she watched him struggle with the aftermath of the affair. His silence was deafening. They would sit in the same room, but feel miles apart, each lost in their own thoughts, each unsure of how to bridge the emotional gap between them. The house that had once been full of warmth and laughter now felt cold and empty, and Nina often found herself wondering if they could ever find their way back to the place they had once been. One particularly difficult evening, Nina reached out to David, her voice trembling as she spoke. "David, I know I've hurt you. I know that I've shattered the trust we had, and I understand why you're angry. I can't take back what I've done, but I will do everything in my power to prove to you that I am sorry every single day." David's gaze was distant as he looked at her, and for a moment, Nina feared he would pull away once again. But then, slowly, he spoke, his voice quiet and weary. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Nina. I don't know if I can ever trust you again, but I want to try. I want to see if we can get through this, even if it takes a lifetime." The words were a mixture of hope and uncertainty, an acknowledgement that while forgiveness might take time, there was still a possibility of healing. It wasn't a promise of reconciliation, but it was the beginning of something perhaps not the same as before, but something new, built on honesty and a shared commitment to rebuild. As Nina worked through the process of rebuilding her marriage, she also embarked on a journey of self-discovery. The affair had forced her to confront her own weaknesses, her tendency to avoid difficult conversations, her fear of confronting her emotions, and her deep-rooted insecurities. She realized that her happiness could not depend solely on David or anyone else. She had to rediscover herself, to become the person she had been before the affair, whole, independent, and self-assured. She began to take small steps to rebuild her own sense of identity. She started journaling, writing down her thoughts and feelings to better understand herself. She reconnected with friends she had neglected, and for the first time in a long while, she took time for herself away from the expectations of others. She went for long walks, spent hours reading, and found solace in the simple act of self-care. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to experience joy without guilt. Therapy continued to be an important part of her healing. With each session, she became more comfortable confronting her fears and insecurities. She began to see her affair not as an isolated incident, but as a symptom of a deeper issue, her inability to communicate her feelings and needs. She had neglected her emotional health for so long, believing that being the perfect wife and mother meant sacrificing her own desires. Now, she realized that taking care of herself was essential, not just for her own well-being, but for the well-being of her marriage. David, too, was on his own path of self-reflection. Though he had been hurt, he had also recognized his own role in the breakdown of their relationship. He had become consumed by work and had distanced himself emotionally from Nina in subtle ways. His focus had shifted, and though it wasn't an excuse for Nina's actions, he understood that he had played a part in creating the distance between them. His journey was not about forgiving Nina alone, but about learning how to reconnect with her emotionally and break free from the patterns of neglect that had formed in their relationship. As time went on, the small steps toward healing began to add up. There were moments of shared laughter, of easy conversations, of quiet mornings spent in each other's presence. They no longer tried to force their relationship to return to what it had been. Instead, they allowed it to evolve, understanding that both of them had changed in profound ways. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, David reached for Nina's hand. His touch was no longer hesitant, but gentle, full of care. For the first time in a long while, Nina felt the stirrings of the connection they had once shared, slow but undeniable. "I don't know what the future holds for us, Nina," David said, his voice steady but sincere. "I can't promise that everything will be the same as it was before, but I'm willing to walk this path with you, slowly, but together. And maybe, just maybe, we can create something better than what we had." Nina squeezed his hand, her heart full of gratitude and hope. She understood the enormity of his words. There was no guarantee, no promise of instant healing, but there was something more important: a willingness to move forward with open hearts, to try, no matter how difficult the road ahead. In that moment, Nina realized that love was not about perfection, it was about resilience, about the willingness to fight for each other even when everything seemed broken. She didn't need David to forgive her immediately. What mattered was that they were willing to try, to face the pain together, and to move forward with intention and care. Months passed, and the process of healing was slow and difficult. But with every passing day, Nina and David learned to live with the imperfections of their relationship. There were still moments of doubt, still times when the past would resurface and cause a momentary strain. But instead of retreating into silence or anger, they had learned to communicate, to express their fears and hopes openly. They no longer tried to bury their emotions. Instead, they faced them together. David had stopped withdrawing into his shell. He no longer kept his pain hidden. He allowed himself to feel the hurt, but he also allowed himself to forgive not just Nina, but himself. He had been part of the emotional distance that had led to Nina's affair, and now he was learning to be more present, more emotionally available. Nina, too, had grown. She had learned the importance of emotional transparency. No longer afraid to speak her mind, she had found her voice again. She no longer relied on others to define her worth. She had found a deep sense of self-respect and independence. She knew that rebuilding their marriage was a continuous process, one that required effort from both of them. But she also knew that they were on the right path, together. The Lover's Secret reveals the painful but powerful truth about relationships. Healing from betrayal requires deep introspection, consistent effort, and the willingness to face difficult truths. Trust, once broken, is not easily rebuilt, but through vulnerability, self-awareness, and time, it is possible to regain what was lost. The story teaches that love is not about perfection, but about resilience, the strength to face the pain, to learn from the mistakes, and to rebuild something new. True healing comes not just from forgiveness, but from the commitment to grow and change, both as individuals and as partners. Knowing that the road to recovery is never linear, but always worth the journey. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you enjoy, then please like and share this video. And don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel. Thank you for watching.